was his Trump moment this morning. Boris Johnson being accused of inciting violence after Sir Keir Starmer was confronted by protesters last night who repeated Jimmy Savile's smears made by the Prime Minister last week in the Commons.
Furious MPs are calling for Boris Johnson to retract his words for saying the Labour leader failed to prosecute Savile during his time as Director of Public Prosecutions. And we're joined now by the Technology Minister, Philp. Morning to you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Do you think that the Prime Minister should come to the Commons and withdraw that statement?
No, I don't, because he already last week, a couple of days after making the comments, clarified that he wasn't suggesting that Keir Starmer was personally and individually responsible for taking the decision. The point he was making was that Keir Starmer ran the CPS as Director of Public Prosecutions and took overall responsibility for what they did. Keir Starmer himself, a few years later, I think in 2013, apologised for the CPS failings, and he was responsible for the CPS. But the very important clarification was made last week that there is no suggestion that Keir Starmer personally took decisions in relation to the Savile case.
OK, let me ask. We've had two very senior responses to what he said. One is the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, who said that his words were perfectly reasonable. And one is the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, who said, I would not have said it. Which camp are you in? The perfectly reasonable or the shouldn't have been said?
Well, I mean, I think they're not mutually contradictory because different people will choose to say different things. Some people might say something, other people might not, and those things can be a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But look, I want to just on this point about the harassment...
Well, hang on a moment. It can't be both a perfectly reasonable thing to say and something that another minister would not have said. Those things are contradictions, and I'm wondering which camp are you in? Do you think it was a perfectly reasonable thing to accuse the opposition leader of?
Look, I think it is perfectly reasonable to draw attention to political leaders' track record running a public organisation in the same way that the Prime Minister gets attacked and criticised, often in very inflammatory and heated terms, for his track record, not just as Prime Minister, but going back to when he was Mayor of London years ago. People criticise him for his record, I think unfairly. People criticise him, and people are entitled, I think, to criticise other political leaders, including the Leader of the Opposition, for actions by the organisations they ran in the past. But look, on this point about the incident yesterday, I would like to just make very clear that the harassment and intimidation suffered by the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, and by David Lammy is completely unacceptable. It has no place at all in a free democracy, and anyone who is involved in that or is thinking of getting involved in that kind of thing just simply should not do it. It is undermining our democracy. I'm glad that the police have made, I think, 2 arrests subsequently. But there is, I don't think there's any way you can link comments made about Keir Starmer's record as DPP with that harassment, not least because, as the Times report today, some of the people involved in that have been doing this for a period of time to other public figures, including Michael Gove and BBC journalist Nick Watt. And if you listen to the tape of that incident yesterday, which is completely unacceptable and appalling, it's about 2 or 3 minutes long. They did mention Jimmy Savile, that is absolutely true, but they mostly were going on about Julian Assange and COVID and all kinds of other things for reasons I don't really understand. So I don't think it's reasonable to make a link between the comments about Keir Starmer's record as DPP and the harassment he suffered yesterday, which is completely unacceptable, and as I say, has no place in a democracy at all.
You may or may not be right about that, but the point is this has left Boris Johnson horribly exposed, hasn't it? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that what you just said about all the other protests that were mixed up in that last night would have happened anyway, and we might have seen very similar scenes. But that's not the point, is it? The point is that people are making the connection. People in your party are making the connection between what was said in the Commons, which was a ridiculous thing for him to say, and that's why he had to clarify it the next day, because it was such a clumsy thing to do. And it's clearly being linked to what happened last night. You may disagree with that analysis, but that's the analysis that people are making. So yet again, the Prime Minister has left himself open to this kind of criticism.
Well, I do disagree with that analysis, because I don't think there is any reasonable way you can say that his drawing attention to Keir Starmer's responsibility for the CPS could in any way have provoked or prompted what we saw last night for the reasons that I've mentioned, already. And you know, almost all of what Boris Johnson has been talking about in recent weeks is about, the government's work tackling COVID, the booster rollout, the fact we've got, record jobs on the payroll, youth unemployment at a record low. Those are the sort of issues that the Prime Minister is spending his time talking about. And those are the issues that are of, I think, genuine interest to people in the country.
So one of your Tory colleagues, the former Cabinet Minister, Julian Smith, is wrong, is he, when he says what happened to Keir Starmer tonight outside Parliament is appalling. It is really important for our democracy and for security that the false Savile slurs made against him are withdrawn in full.
Well, Julian is absolutely correct in saying that what happened to Keir Starmer and David Lammy, the harassment and intimidation that they suffered, is completely unacceptable, has no place in a free democracy. So he's completely right in saying that. I don't think he's right to link that to what was said previously. And I also think with the clarification that, just to remove any scope for misunderstanding, that the Prime Minister made a day or two after the original comments, that he was not suggesting that Keir Starmer personally and individually had responsibility for the Savile case, but he did have responsibility for the CPS as a whole, as its leader. I think that is a reasonable point to make. And political leaders on both sides rightly get held to account for the performance of organisations which they run, even where they weren't responsible for a particular individual decision.
Can I just ask, OK, you're defending its relevance. What it did, when the Prime Minister stood up in the House of Commons and said that at the Labour leader, was it harnessed the pain of hundreds of victims of a serial sexual predator in order to make a political point. The debate was not about the crimes of Jimmy Savile. That was lobbed in like a hand grenade. And one of the lawyers for some of the victims has reflected on how painful that is for those victims. It was completely out of context and it was immensely hurtful. You have Tory colleagues also saying the same thing, and we now have a mob who are harassing the Labour leader using the name Jimmy Savile, which must exacerbate the pain for those victims. How can you double down and defend the Prime Minister in those circumstances?
Well, look, I don't think it's right or fair to suggest that the people last night, the mob, who were harassing and intimidating Keir Starmer and David Lammy, which was obviously completely wrong, were provoked or prompted into doing so by the comments about Keir Starmer's record.
Right, you have made that point. I'm asking about the original point. How can you defend the use of that case with all the sensitivity? And let's not forget, one of the Prime Minister's closest advisors has resigned over his use of that case in the House of Commons. How can you defend that?
Well, the relevant context is that Keir Starmer was attacking Boris Johnson that day, just over a week ago, for his custodianship of the Number 10 operation, the government more generally, making criticisms of his record. And the Prime Minister was pointing out, in passing, in return, that Keir Starmer's record as Director of Public Prosecutions was not without blemish. And indeed, Keir Starmer has apologised for the failings the CPS had in relation to that incident. So it was simply pointing out that Keir Starmer himself, in throwing accusations in the other direction, is not without blemish himself when it comes to custodianship of an organisation like the CPS. But lest there was any...
Let's not forget, the Prime Minister himself is under investigation for breaking rules.
But lest there was any scope for misunderstanding...
It was a distraction.
Lest there was any scope for misunderstanding, he clarified a couple of days later, I think in Blackpool, that he was not suggesting Keir Starmer personally was responsible for the Savile decision. So he clarified that very quickly within a couple of days, which is important.
Mr Philp, what if we were doing this interview in 2 or 3 days' time and something like this has just happened again?
Well, look, as I said before, politicians comment on each other's track record as custodians of public organisations the whole time. But the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson himself, receives criticism, I think unfair, for his custodianship of the government, his time as Mayor of London, right? Criticising an opponent's track record as a custodian of a public organisation, was a leader of a public organisation, is something which happens, on a widespread basis. And you don't hear opposition politicians holding back when it comes to criticise, rightly, really, voicing what they see as criticisms of their political opponents. But I say, if you look at that, the incident last night, totally unacceptable harassment last night. According to the Times, these are people who have been doing this over a period of time to other people as well, like Michael Gove and Nick Watt. And the majority of the comments they were shouting, as far as I could hear from the tape, were about Julian Assange. Jimmy Savile was mentioned, but the majority were about Julian Assange, just to be completely clear about that.
I do wonder, having done quite a lot of these shows in the last month or so, if you guys in government are getting tired of having to defend Boris Johnson all the time. It just seems to happen almost every day. You're having to come on and do hairpin turns about the latest thing that he's alleged to have done.
And bearing in mind, Mr. Philp, that you have a really important policy announcement to make, which is about restricting access by children to offensive material online, to pornography websites. And then the Prime Minister, comes out into the House of Commons, says something offensive, and that's what you end up talking about.
Well, look, I'll tell you what I'm happy to defend in terms of Boris Johnson's leadership. I'm happy to defend the fact we've got more jobs on the payroll than at any time in history, the lowest youth unemployment, the leading rollout of the booster programme. Omicron was handled very, very well, despite the fact people were saying, close down Christmas. He made the right decision on that. He's showing international leadership on the Russia-Ukraine issue that we haven't talked about at all, showing genuine leadership in supporting the Ukrainian government who are under threat and leading the way on preparing a comprehensive sanctions package if Russia does violate Ukrainian sovereignty. Those are the things that I think are really important, right, to our country and to people.
He also stood up in the House of Commons and said that crime was down. And then we found out that actually that's if you don't include fraud and computer crime. As the tech minister, aren't you worried about fraud and computer crime?
Yes, absolutely worried about fraud and computer crime.
So if you include those in the crime figures, crime hasn't gone down, has it?
That's right. So the reason that quite often the crime figures get reported excluding fraud and computer crime is that the time series going back over a number of years has historically excluded those offences. So if you want to do like a long-term comparison, very often fraud and computer misuse get excluded from the crime figures. And if you exclude them, it's gone down. If you include them, it's gone up. But if you... But to be clear, I do take it very seriously. Okay. Fraud is an incredibly serious issue. And we're going to be taking some further action on the fraud issue via legislation that we've got coming up. Because it is so serious.
But you see my point. Here we go. You're having to defend him again. All the time. You're having to defend things that he said and done. All the time. It's become a complete
We have to let you go. Chris Philp, thanks very much.
We haven't talked about the online age verification.
I tried. Chris Philp, thanks very much indeed.